Title: The Face in the Dark. Chapter 1. The Encounter. The night air was thick with the weight of the unknown. Elliot's boots echoed on the rain-slicked pavement as he walked home from the office, the dim glow of streetlights offering little protection from the oppressive darkness that wrapped itself around the city. The urban landscape, typically bustling with life, now felt strangely empty. The only sounds were the rhythmic tapping of his footsteps and the occasional rumble of distant thunder, signaling that a storm was nearing. He should have been used to it by now. The loneliness, the shadows that stretched unnaturally in the night, the constant hum of the city that never truly allowed silence. But tonight was different. A strange sensation crawled along his spine, like the sudden presence of something watching him, something lurking just out of sight. Elliot paused for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. The street behind him seemed empty. No one was there, yet the feeling remained. A gnawing sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind, telling him that something was wrong, that something was waiting. He quickened his pace, his breath shallow as his pulse quickened. The sound of his footsteps became more pronounced in the stillness, each one an unsettling reminder of his solitude. The city, for all its size, seemed to shrink around him, the buildings looming higher and the alleyways darker than they should have been. It felt as if the city itself had become a living, breathing thing, watching him, breathing down his neck. As Elliot neared the intersection, a figure emerged from the shadows up ahead. Barely visible at first, a silhouette draped in darkness, the figure moved slowly, almost purposefully, as if drawn to him, as if it had been waiting there for him all along. Elliot's stomach churned with instinctual dread. His rational mind screamed at him to keep walking, to ignore the growing knot in his gut, but something compelled him to stop. The figure stood still, unmoving, its face hidden in the darkness. For a moment, Elliot thought it might just be a passerby, someone caught in the rain like him. But as he took a step forward, he noticed something. The figure wasn't standing naturally. There was an unnatural stiffness to its posture, its limbs slightly out of place, as if it didn't belong. A cold chill swept over Elliot, his eyes fixed on the figure, and his heart seemed to freeze in his chest. Something was wrong. It wasn't the person he expected. He could feel the air thickening, heavy with an unspoken dread. Without thinking, Elliot took another step, drawn to the figure as if some invisible force was pulling him closer. His pulse pounded in his ears, but his feet moved forward of their own accord. His breath came in shallow gasps, the world narrowing until only the figure in the distance remained. And then, as if responding to his movement, the figure turned. Elliot stopped in his tracks, his breath caught in his throat. There was no mistaking it now. The face that stared back at him was not human, not in the way that he understood it. The face was distorted, twisted, a grotesque mockery of human features. The skin was stretched taut, the eyes wide open, filled with an unearthly terror. The mouth hung open in a scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the scream was trapped inside, a desperate, silent cry for help, a cry that would never reach anyone. The man's face, or whatever it was, looked as if it had been through unimaginable suffering. The skin was pale, slick with something dark and wet, like sweat or blood. But it didn't look real. It looked wrong. The eyes, wide and unblinking, were pools of fear, raw, agonizing fear. But what struck Elliot most was the expression. The fear on that face wasn't just an emotion. It was alive. The fear was in the air, around them, radiating from the figure as if it had become one with the thing standing before him. Elliot wanted to turn and run, but his legs felt frozen to the spot. His eyes were locked on the figure. The longer he stared, the more his mind began to unravel, as if it could not comprehend what it was seeing. Then, the figure took a step forward. The world went silent. The streets around them seemed to dissolve. The sound of the wind, the distant hum of cars, all disappeared, leaving only the sound of Elliot's heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was watch, horrified, as the figure moved closer. And then, it spoke. "Fear me," the figure whispered, its voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to come from every direction at once. It was a voice that scraped against Elliot's skin, sending an icy shiver down his spine. Fear me, or become me. The words hung in the air, twisting in Elliot's mind. It wasn't just the words themselves that terrified him. It was the force behind them, the weight of the fear that seemed to seep into his very bones. Before he could react, the figure lunged at him. Elliot gasped and stumbled backward, his feet tangling beneath him as he tried to flee. His mind screamed at him to run, to get away, but his body was frozen in place, trapped in the face of his own terror. He could hear the figure's footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, each one dragging him deeper into the nightmare. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of doom. He glanced over his shoulder, and for a moment his vision blurred. But through the haze of panic, he saw it again. The face, closer now, its eyes wide, its mouth open, as if to devour him whole. The fear had become real, tangible, as though it were a living creature, stalking him through the streets. Elliot's legs gave way beneath him. He fell to his knees, his palms scraping against the wet pavement. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat felt tight, constricted by an invisible force that tightened with every breath. His mind was reeling. He was losing his grip on reality. This wasn't just fear, it was something more. The world around him began to distort. The edges of his vision darkened, and the cityscape began to dissolve. Buildings twisted, and shadows stretched into grotesque shapes, clawing toward him. The face was everywhere. It was in the air, in the ground beneath him, in the very essence of the night. He was trapped in it, suffocating under its gaze. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The street was empty. The air was still. The world seemed to return to normal, but Elliot knew it wasn't. The presence lingered, a cold, unshakable weight on his shoulders. He could feel it, watching him, waiting for him to slip again. He staggered to his feet, his knees trembling beneath him. His hands gripped his head as if he could force the image of that face from his mind. But it was too late. It was already inside him. The terror had taken root, and it would never let him go. Chapter 1. The Encounter, Part 2. Elliot stumbled down the alley, his pulse still erratically racing, his breaths shallow and panicked. The chill of the night had burrowed deep into his skin. But the cold didn't bother him anymore. It was the unshakable feeling of being watched that gnawed at him, a presence so palpable it seemed to vibrate through the air itself. His mind refused to settle. The image of the face, twisted and grotesque, branded into the back of his eyelids. His body moved on instinct, his legs carrying him without purpose, without thought. He didn't even know where he was going anymore. The city had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, each corner more oppressive than the last. The streetlights ahead blinked, their glow flickering weakly, as if even they were trying to escape the weight that had settled over the city. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, every step he took echoing too loudly in the hollow silence that surrounded him. His head jerked back, and his eyes frantically scanned the shadows, his hands trembling as he gripped his jacket tightly around himself. The figure, the face, it couldn't be real, could it? There was no logical explanation, no reason his mind should conjure up such an awful thing. But the dread still lingered, thick in the air like an invisible fog. It's just my imagination, he told himself. It's nothing more than the stress, the darkness playing tricks on me. But even as he repeated the words, he knew they were lies. His instincts screamed at him, urging him to flee, to run as far and as fast as possible. His mind swirled with frantic thoughts, but none of them brought comfort. The fear, that tangible, suffocating fear, felt real in a way nothing had before. He rounded another corner and saw the empty streets ahead. A wave of nausea hit him as he realized he was no longer sure of where he was. The city felt alien now, distorted by the terrifying memory of what he had just seen. Everything was wrong. The pavement beneath his shoes felt like it was shifting, as though it were no longer solid, but liquid. A pulsating, living thing. He pressed his hand to his forehead, trying to steady himself. And then he heard it. A sound, soft like a breath on the wind, barely a whisper. but unmistakable. Footsteps. At first they were faint, so faint he thought they were just an extension of his own panic. But as he strained to listen, they grew clearer, closer, slow, methodical. No, 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 no. Elliot's heart raced as the steps drew nearer, each one echoing in the pit of his stomach like a drum. He forced himself to turn, his eyes desperately searching for the source. There was nothing, no one. The alley was empty. The streetlights overhead flickered again, casting brief, unreliable shadows across the pavement. The footsteps continued, right behind him now, close enough that he could almost feel the breath of the unseen figure against his neck. He whirled around, his pulse in his throat, his vision blurring in his panic. Nothing. He was alone. He had to be. But why couldn't he shake the feeling of being followed? That same feeling from moments before, as if the very air around him had taken on a life of its own. The city itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as though it were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He clenched his fists. The fear was rising again, curling in his chest like a knot of ice. He couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around him, the narrow alley narrowing even further, the shadows stretching longer than they should have. The hairs on the back of his neck tingled, prickling with dread. Then, a soft laugh broke the silence. It was faint at first, a low, hollow sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the alley. But as it grew louder, Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It was a laugh of mockery, a laugh that seemed to mock him, his fear, his very existence. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no." The laugh became louder, more deliberate, as though someone, or something, was enjoying his torment. It echoed off the walls, reverberating in his skull, until Elliot thought his mind might snap. Suddenly, there was a shift in the air, a strange stillness. The sound of the footsteps had ceased. The laugh had stopped. And yet, the dread remained, thicker than ever. Elliot froze. A sound, the scraping of something against metal, filled the air, followed by a thud. His eyes darted to the ground. There, at his feet, was a small, dark object, a jagged piece of metal, glistening wet in the pale light of the street lamp. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the street light flickered and died. The world plunged into complete darkness, a noise. It was faint at first, but Elliot's ears strained to catch it. It was a soft scratching sound, like nails dragging against the pavement. Then it came again, closer and closer. Elliot's heart hammered against his chest as his body began to tremble uncontrollably. His eyes darted in every direction, but there was no source to the noise. No sign of the figure, or the laugh, or any explanation for what was happening. Another scrape, another step. It was right there, behind him. He spun around. The darkness swallowed everything, but in the center of it, standing as if it were birthed from the shadows themselves, was the face. The face. Elliot's breath caught in his throat, his body paralyzed with terror. It was no longer just an image in his mind. It was real. Its eyes were wide, unblinking. Its mouth was stretched in an expression of agony that seemed to reach from the depths of the abyss. But there was no sound, no scream. The face was silent, but its gaze felt like 1,000 knives pressing into his skin. It was the same face. The same thing that had haunted him moments before. Elliot opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. His body felt like stone, frozen in place, his muscles rigid with fear. "It's not real," he thought desperately. "It can't be real." But the terror gnawed at him, clawing at the edges of his mind. And then the thing smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or amusement. No, this was a smile born of something far darker, a predatory grin that promised nothing but suffering. The expression twisted, contorted, as if the face itself were trying to pull itself into something else entirely, something that wasn't human. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice but a whisper in his very soul, the figure spoke again. "Fear me," it hissed, the words curling around him like tendrils of smoke. "Fear me, and I will show you the face of your own death." Chapter 3. The Unseen Hand, Part 1. Elliot awoke to the sensation of suffocating darkness, his breath shallow, his body drenched in sweat. His surroundings were unfamiliar, the once familiar apartment now feeling like a foreign, oppressive space. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest, the sound of it deafening in his ears. He shot up in bed, the covers tangled around him like chains, his limbs frozen with panic. The night had returned, but it felt different now. The air was thicker, colder, suffused with an ominous heaviness that pressed against him from all sides. He fumbled for his phone on the nightstand, the screen illuminating his trembling fingers. 2:33 a.m. The numbers blinked back at him, mocking him, the silence around him stretching out like a vast void. Had I been dreaming? He couldn't remember the details of the nightmare he had just woken from, but he could feel its after effects. The lingering terror, the way his heart raced, the ice-cold sensation that seemed to seep into his very soul. It was as though the darkness itself had a form, a presence, and it wasn't done with him yet. Elliot swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the cold hardwood floor. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling of dread that clung to him like a second skin. His apartment, usually so quiet, was eerily still. He looked over at the window. The blinds were drawn, the outside world obscured, but something told him to check. Something told him that whatever was coming for him, it wouldn't care about the walls of his apartment. He crossed the room, his steps silent, but his heart thundering like a drum in his chest. The blinds were pulled tight, but his hand trembled as he reached for them. The air around him seemed to shift as his fingers brushed the fabric. For a moment he hesitated. The feeling of being watched crept over him once more. And then, with a swift motion, he yanked the blinds open. The world outside was a blur of shadows, the streetlights casting long, twisted silhouettes across the pavement. The city, once so familiar, now felt alien. But it was what he saw, or rather, what he didn't see, that made his blood run cold. There, in the empty street, stood a figure. Its outline was obscured by the dark, but Elliot knew immediately what it was. The same figure, the same face that had haunted his every thought. That horrific, grinning visage. His breath hitched as the figure slowly turned, its movement unnatural, like a marionette jerked by unseen strings. Elliot's heart pounded in his ears, his throat constricting with terror. The figure raised a hand, its long fingers curling in a mockery of a wave. A sharp, unnatural sound followed, the crackling of bone, as if the joints in its hand were grinding together. It's not real, he thought. It can't be real. I'm dreaming. I must be dreaming. But then, the figure's mouth opened. A voice, raspy and drenched in malice, slipped through the glass like a poison. "Come to me, Elliot." The words were low, guttural, and filled with an unbearable weight. The sound was like a command, an unholy summons that made his stomach churn. He backed away from the window, his mind screaming, but his body frozen in place. The figure, no, the thing, was real. It was real, and it was here, just outside his window, beckoning him. The world around him felt like it was closing in, the air thick with a malevolent force that pressed against him. The walls seemed to shift and bend, the shadows elongating, crawling toward him like living things. Every corner of the room felt suffused with the presence of something that did not belong. He could hear it now, the whispering, the faint scratching at the back of his mind. It was as if something was calling to him, pulling him toward the darkness. His body was no longer his own. He tried to fight it, tried to turn away, but his legs moved against his will, dragging him toward the door. A scream bubbled up in his throat, but it was swallowed by the suffocating silence. The world had become a blur of shadow and fear, the edges of his reality beginning to disintegrate. He was no longer in control, and the worst part was that he knew it. His hand reached for the doorknob, his fingers slick with sweat. The door creaked open, the sound like a dying breath, and he stepped into the hallway. The apartment complex was eerily quiet, but the air was thick with the same stifling pressure that had filled his room. He didn't know where he was going or why he was walking, but he couldn't stop himself. Down the corridor, a faint light flickered from an open doorway. Elliot's eyes were drawn to it, as if some invisible force were guiding him toward it. As he approached, the air grew colder, the light more fevered, flickering like a dying flame. The door stood ajar, its hinges creaking with every gust of wind. It wasn't just the light. It was the sound that caught his attention. Soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper. But as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a whisper. It was a voice. A voice that seemed to be calling his name. Elliot! The voice echoed through the narrow hallway, its tone filled with an intimacy that sent shivers down his spine. It wasn't the same voice as before, the voice of the figure outside. No, this voice was worse. It was warm, comforting. It lured him in, tempting him with promises of relief from the terror that had gripped him. Elliot! He stepped closer to the door, his hand outstretched, his heart beating so loudly that it drowned out everything else. The voice was sweet now, almost familiar, like a lover's whisper in the dark. He didn't know what compelled him to step inside the room. He didn't even remember opening the door, but he was there now. The light was dim, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. In the center of the room, on a pedestal, sat a mirror. It was old, the glass cracked and warped, but its surface gleamed as if polished by unseen hands. He approached the mirror slowly, hypnotically, his reflection blurring as he leaned closer. For a moment he didn't recognize himself, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. But then, something shifted in the mirror. The reflection of the room began to warp, the shadows twisting and elongating until they seemed to reach out toward him. And then, there it was, a face, not his own, not anyone's he recognized, the figure from outside, the thing with the twisted smile. It grinned at him from the mirror, its eyes wide and unblinking. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as the reflection began to move, its mouth stretching wider, its grin widening into something grotesque. No. Elliot wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body was paralyzed, his feet glued to the floor. The thing in the mirror leaned closer, its breath fogging up the glass as it whispered to him. Come closer, Elliot. The voice was no longer soft or familiar. It was now a shrieking, guttural growl that reverberated in the air like 1,000 nails scraping down a chalkboard. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as the figure in the mirror reached toward him, its hands outstretched, fingers elongated, twitching with malevolent intent. With a surge of panic, Elliot broke free from the trance. He turned and bolted for the door, his legs shaking beneath him. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls pressing in, the door growing further away with every step. Behind him, the laughter began again. Chapter 3. The Unseen Hand, Part 2. Elliot's feet pounded against the floorboards, each step carrying him further from the nightmare that clung to the room. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling as if he had been running for miles. But there was no escape. He knew that now. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he pushed himself, that presence, the unseen hand, would always be waiting for him. The hallway seemed to stretch on infinitely, the walls narrowing, the ceilings sagging lower with each passing step. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the building itself was watching, listening, biding its time. The laughter, that low, haunting chuckle, drifted behind him like a persistent shadow. The closer he got to the door, the louder it grew, until it reverberated in his very bones, drowning out everything else. With a surge of panic, he reached the door, his escape, gripping the handle with white knuckles. But as his fingers closed around it, a sudden chill ran up his spine. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with an unnatural heaviness that pressed against his eardrums. The air grew colder, so cold that his breath came out in visible puffs of vapor, even though the apartment had never been this cold before. He turned the handle. The door refused to budge. His pulse quickened. He yanked at the knob again, desperately, but it was as though the door had fused with the frame. The wood was slick, resistant, a barrier that wouldn't yield. A low growl emanated from the other side of the door, something that wasn't human, a sound that felt ancient and filled with an unearthly hunger. Elliot's hands trembled violently as he backed away, his eyes darting around the hallway for another exit. But there was nothing. The windows were too high up. The walls were too solid. The door, now the only way out, was locked by forces far beyond his understanding. And then, he heard it again. The whisper. It was faint at first, just a shiver of sound, like a breeze passing through the cracks of the building, but it was unmistakable. That voice. The same one he had heard before. The one that had reached out to him through the mirror. The one that had called his name. It was closer now, right behind him. Elliot! The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the voice slithered through the air, wrapping itself around his consciousness like a noose. He turned slowly, afraid of what he might see. And yet the hallway was still empty. No figure, no shadows moving. It's in my head, he thought, shaking his head violently as if he could physically force the thoughts out of his mind. This is just a nightmare. I'll wake up any second. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. This wasn't a nightmare. It was real. It was happening, and no amount of denial could change that. Another whisper, this time louder, more insistent, came from the shadows just beyond his reach. Come closer, Elliot. Don't be afraid. It will all be over soon. He froze. The voice wasn't coming from behind him anymore. It was all around him, echoing in the corners of his mind. His heart raced as he realized that the voice was not just inside his head. It was coming from the walls themselves. A sudden sensation of being watched overwhelmed him. It was as if 1,000 eyes were staring at him from the darkness, dissecting his every movement, waiting for him to make a mistake. The weight of it was crushing. He could feel the heat of invisible gazes seeping into his skin, crawling beneath it, burrowing into the deepest parts of his soul. You can't run from me, Elliot. The voice purred, a serpentine hiss that curled into his ears. You can't hide. I will find you. I always find you. He spun around, his eyes wild. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor creaking beneath his feet. The lights above flickered, the glow stuttering, as if the building itself was breathing, alive with malice. Elliot's pulse raced as his gaze darted to the mirror in the far corner of the hallway. It was there again. The mirror. It had appeared out of nowhere, the glass reflecting the darkness around it like a hungry mouth, waiting to consume him whole. But this time, it wasn't just the mirror that called to him. It was the shape that stood in front of it. That same twisted silhouette. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He recognized it immediately. It was the same thing that had haunted him from the beginning. The creature that had grinned at him from the street. It was real. It was here, in his apartment, in the very hallway where he stood frozen in terror. The figure stepped closer to the mirror, its movement fluid but unnatural. The floorboards groaned under its weight, the air growing colder as it drew nearer. Elliot's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs were paralyzed, his body refusing to obey. The creature's form was becoming clearer now, the shadows giving way to a grotesque image of impossibility. It was tall, too tall for any human. Its limbs were elongated and twisted, its fingers thin and too long, like branches of a dead tree. The face, if you could even call it that, was a contorted mask of agony and pleasure, an impossible mixture of both. Its eyes were wide, almost unblinking, filled with a deep black void that seemed to devour light itself. But it was its mouth that struck terror into Elliot's heart. A gaping maw, too large for any creature, lined with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, like the teeth of a predator that fed on fear itself. The thing tilted its head as it studied him, its long neck creaking with an audible snap. And then, it spoke. You've been waiting for me, haven't you? The voice was not the same as before. This time, it was deep, gravelly, like a growl from the depths of hell itself. It didn't just speak the words. It breathed them into Elliot's very soul, each syllable crawling through his veins like ice. I am your creation, Elliot. You called me into being, and now you must suffer the consequences. Elliot's eyes widened in disbelief. What are you talking about? I didn't create you. The creature grinned. Oh, but you did. All those late nights, all those thoughts, those desires. You were always searching for something. You wanted to know what lay beyond the veil, and now you've seen it. Now you belong to it. The words were like poison in his ears, their weight bearing down on him, suffocating him. He stumbled backward, his hand reaching blindly for the door, but it was no use. The door no longer existed. The hallway had become a cage, the walls closing in on him, the shadows stretching like tendrils, grasping at him from every direction. "You'll never escape," the creature hissed, its voice now a cacophony of whispers, all speaking at once. "I'll always be here, Elliot, watching, waiting." The last thing Elliot saw was the thing's mouth opening wide, the teeth glistening like knives. Then, the world went black. Chapter 4. The Hollow Echoes. Elliot awoke to silence. A silence that was not like any other. It was as if the world had stopped, as though the universe had pressed a pause button, leaving only the void. His body felt cold, stiff, and his head throbbed with an intensity that made it seem as if his skull might crack open at any moment. He tried to lift his hand to his temple, but it wouldn't move. His limbs felt foreign, heavy, as though something was anchoring him to the ground. He blinked, his eyelids trembling, struggling to fight off the drowsiness that still clung to him like a second skin. The room around him was pitch dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to suck the life out of everything it touched. He tried to move again, but this time he succeeded, his hands pressing against the floor, feeling its rough texture beneath his fingertips. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, the weight of his body dragging him back down as though the floor was pulling him into its depths. With a gasp, he sat up, his mind scrambling to piece together what had happened. His apartment, his home, was gone. The walls that once surrounded him were now missing, and in their place was something far worse. A vast, endless chasm, stretching out into the unknown, swallowing the light. There were no windows, no doors, no sense of direction, just an abyss. A void that seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, as if it were alive. His heart began to race. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mouth was dry and the taste of metal lingered on his tongue. Panic began to set in. Where am I? What happened to me? He looked around frantically, trying to find something, anything that made sense. But there was nothing. Just the blackness, the suffocating silence, and the faint echo of his own breath. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, as though the very atmosphere was rotting around him. There was no wind, no sound of life, just the oppressive weight of isolation. Then he heard it. A soft rustling, like the whisper of paper being moved by a breeze. But there was no breeze here. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing as the noise grew louder, more distinct. The rustling was followed by a soft, almost inaudible clicking sound, like the tapping of claws against the ground. It was coming from somewhere ahead of him. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming faster now. He felt his body react before his mind could catch up. He began to move, instinctively trying to crawl toward the sound, desperate to find a way out. But as he advanced, the sound seemed to shift, moving just out of his reach, taunting him, like some unseen force playing a cruel game. The darkness pressed in around him, the air growing thicker, colder. He could feel his hands shaking as he crawled, his fingers brushing against the unseen floor beneath him, feeling the jagged edges of broken stone, the slickness of something damp. His thoughts raced. Am I still in the apartment? Is this some kind of hellish dream? Suddenly there was a sharp noise, like a screech of metal, tearing through the silence. Elliot recoiled, his body jerking involuntarily. His pulse quickened. It was close now, whatever it was. He pushed forward, his fingers scraping against the cold floor as he moved faster, the sound of the clicking claws growing louder, more distinct, until it was right next to him. Elliot felt something cold brush against his arm, like fingers, but when he whipped around, there was nothing there. The darkness remained, impenetrable, as though the air itself was closing in on him. And then, he heard it. The whisper, a voice, familiar and yet foreign, whispered his name in the same low, guttural tone as before. It was close, so close that he could feel the breath of the speaker on the back of his neck. The voice was not human. It sounded like something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries, its very existence a forbidden secret. "Elliot!" he gasped, his breath hitching in his throat. The voice was too familiar. too close. His eyes darted around, his pulse pounding in his ears, but there was no one. Nothing, just the endless, suffocating dark. "You're not alone," the voice whispered again, this time a low chuckle following the words, sending a ripple of fear down Elliot's spine. Elliot's body moved against his will. His muscles twitched as if some unseen hand was pulling the strings, guiding him, making him move forward. His hands, his legs, his entire body was no longer under his control. He could feel his heart slamming against his chest, the panic rising as he moved toward the voice. He didn't want to go, didn't want to face whatever was calling to him, but he couldn't stop. The pull was too strong, the force too overwhelming. The clicking of claws grew louder, more frantic, as if something was getting closer, circling him like a predator toying with its prey. He tried to scream, but the words stuck in his throat. His breath caught in his chest, suffocating him. "Come to me, Elliot," the voice coaxed, seductive, almost gentle. "Come see what you've created." Elliot's mind raced. "What do you mean? What creation?" But the question died in his throat as the darkness seemed to open before him, a vast expanse of shadow stretching into infinity. The sound of claws tapping against the stone floor was deafening now, filling every inch of his being with terror. He felt himself moving forward, drawn to the center of this hellish place. And then he saw it. A figure. It was standing in the center of the void, its back turned toward him, as still as a statue. The figure was tall, far too tall for a human, its shape distorted, twisted, like it was made of shadows and nightmares. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its body spindly, and its head was too large, hanging at an odd angle. It was as if it had been torn from the fabric of reality itself and shoved into this forsaken place. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly turned around, its face coming into view. But it was not a face that belonged to any human. No, it was something worse, something far darker. Its features were a grotesque mask of anguish and madness, its eyes wide and unblinking, empty voids that seemed to swallow all light. Its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, the lips curled back in a way that was too wide, too stretched. "You remember me, don't you?" the creature crooned, its voice sending a tremor through Elliot's body. "You made me." Elliot's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground. His mind was racing, spinning, as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had not created this thing. It couldn't be real. It was just a hallucination, a nightmare brought to life. Yet, as the creature's grin widened, as its hollow eyes locked onto his, Elliot knew it was real. It was here. The creature's mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, its jagged teeth gleaming in the darkness. "You can't escape, Elliot. Not from me. Not from this." A cold wave of terror washed over him as the creature took a step forward, and then it lunged. Chapter 5. The Depths of Suffering. The creature's unhinged jaws snapped shut with an ear-splitting crack, a sound like bones breaking under the weight of 1,000 years. Elliot tried to scramble backward, but his limbs felt like they were encased in ice. The darkness around him pressed in tighter, each second dragging him deeper into a nightmare he could no longer escape. His breath was shallow, his chest heaving as the air thickened, becoming almost solid, stifling him. He tried to scream, but only a strangled rasp escaped his lips. His eyes remained fixed on the grotesque thing in front of him, a thing of nightmares, but somehow, so much worse. It was not merely its form that twisted his insides with fear, but the fact that he knew it, that he had created it, or worse, summoned it into existence. "Please," he whispered, his voice weak and broken, his throat raw. "I didn't mean it. I never meant it." The creature tilted its head, its enormous grin stretching wider, impossibly so. A low, guttural sound rumbled from deep within its chest, a chuckle, a mocking laugh, as if it found his fear amusing. Its hands, too long, too sharp, reached for him, the claws scraping the ground with a sickening screech. "Fool," it hissed. "You will mean it. You have meant it. You cannot undo what has been done." Elliot closed his eyes, trying to will himself out of this nightmare. But when he opened them again, the figure was closer, looming over him like an unstoppable force. Its form seemed to shift with every blink, flickering in and out of focus, like the distorted image of a shadow cast by a flickering candle. He scrambled backward again, his legs shaking, hands searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the endless abyss. The creature, however, seemed to glide toward him, its claws leaving black, seeping marks on the ground, as though it was wearing the darkness itself as a skin. "You brought me here," it said again, its voice a slow rasp, each syllable like a nail being dragged across a chalkboard. "You created me. You called to me." "No," Elliot gasped, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs. "I didn't." "You did," it interrupted, its smile never faltering. "You did." With a sudden, violent movement, the creature lunged at him. Elliot barely had time to react before its claws sank deep into his flesh, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his body. His body convulsed, unable to free itself from the vice-like grip that held him in place. The world spun, and he felt the ground beneath him crumble, as if he were being dragged into some deeper, darker realm. His screams echoed into the nothingness, but there was no one to hear. The void. When Elliot regained consciousness, he found himself in a different place. The air was heavier now, suffocating, thick with the smell of decay and something much worse: rot. The darkness was absolute, stretching out endlessly in every direction. It was as if he had crossed into another dimension, a world that had forgotten the meaning of light. There was no sky here, no horizon, just the suffocating blackness. He could hear it now, the whispers, the soft, incessant murmurs that were constantly in the background of his thoughts. At first they had been distant, almost imperceptible, but now they were closer, clearer, more pressing. They were not words, at least not ones that he could understand. They were fragments of sounds, distorted and broken, like a language he had never known, but which was becoming familiar, seeping into his mind, crawling under his skin. "You are lost!" The words slithered through his mind, like a cold wind through the cracks of a forgotten building. His heart skipped a beat. The voice was not the creature's. It was softer, more distant, but it carried the same oppressive weight. It felt ancient and sad, full of despair, like the remnants of something long dead. "Who?" Elliot whispered, his voice trembling in the void. But there was no answer, just a deeper silence, one that stretched on infinitely. And yet the whispers continued, surrounding him, pulling him further into the abyss. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear his mind apart to escape it, but nothing would come. His throat was dry, cracked, as if he hadn't spoken in days or years. His body felt hollow, drained of strength. Every part of him ached. It felt as though his very soul was being pulled apart, thread by thread. His hands shot out in front of him, instinctively searching for something, anything solid to anchor himself. But the ground beneath him was soft, swallowing him, like quicksand. He tried to pull away, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank. Panic rose in his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The whispers grew louder now, frantic, as though the void itself was alive with suffering, with regret. And then, just when he thought he could not endure another moment, it happened. A shadow moved across the dark. At first, Elliot thought it was just his mind playing tricks, the result of too much fear, too much exhaustion. But then it grew, taking form, a shape, a figure, something far worse than the creature that had first haunted him. The figure loomed over him, tall and thin, its limbs elongated, twisted in unnatural angles. Its eyes, two glowing orbs, fixed upon him with a cold, malicious intent. The darkness seemed to press around it, as though it were feeding on the shadows themselves. "Welcome," the figure whispered in a voice that was a soft hiss, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. "Welcome to the depths." Elliot recoiled, his body shuddering as the figure stepped closer. He tried to speak, But the words wouldn't come. His mind was overwhelmed, struggling to comprehend the nightmare he was now a part of. "Do you see?" the figure asked, its voice smooth, like silk. "Do you see what you've created? The suffering you've unleashed? You think you can escape?" Elliot tried to stand, but his legs gave way beneath him. The ground seemed to shift and ripple beneath him, as if it were alive, writhing, undulating like something monstrous. The figure's presence seemed to pull at him, weighing him down. Escape. I never wanted this. I didn't mean for this. The figure's eyes burned brighter, glowing with an unnatural intensity. "No one ever does." Suddenly, the ground beneath Elliot's hands gave way, crumbling into nothingness, leaving him hanging in mid-air, weightless. And that was when the whispers came again. Louder, more urgent. "Get out," they hissed. "Get out, before it's too late." Chapter 5. The Depths of Suffering, Part 2. The whispers continued to claw at Elliot's mind. They were not just sounds anymore, not just distant murmurs that haunted the edges of his consciousness. They were voices, countless voices, screaming, pleading, wailing in agony, all trapped within the void that surrounded him. The air itself felt thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The weight of it was unbearable, as if the very atmosphere was alive, feeding on his terror, his despair. His breath caught in his throat, short and frantic. Panic clawed at his chest, constricting his lungs. But no matter how hard he gasped, no air seemed to fill them. His heart hammered in his chest like a caged animal desperate to escape its confines. "Get out!" the whispers urged, voices like nails on glass, scraping across his mind. "Get out, before it consumes you completely." Elliot tried to push himself to his feet, but the ground beneath him wasn't solid. His fingers scraped against the floor, but it felt as though he was trying to grasp at the shifting sands of time itself, slipping, useless. His body trembled, drained of all energy, his legs refusing to obey his desperate commands. The creature, the one he had created, was still there, waiting in the shadows, always just out of sight. He could feel its presence, a suffocating pressure that seemed to ripple through the darkness, tugging at his very soul. "You cannot hide from it," the figure whispered, its voice a low, melodious hum, like the song of a siren. "You cannot escape what is already within you." Elliot's hands shot to his head, his fingers digging into his scalp as if trying to claw away the thoughts, the fear, the memory of the creature. But nothing worked. The thoughts only grew louder, more insistent. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw its twisted, monstrous form, its eyes like black voids, endless and deep. Its grin twisted into something unspeakable. He could feel its claws digging into his flesh again, as if it were still feeding off his fear, as if it were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "No!" Elliot gasped. "No! I didn't mean it! I didn't create you. I didn't—" But the voice of the figure was already too close, echoing around him with a predatory tone. "You cannot lie to yourself, Elliot. You called me. You called me from the depths. And now, I am here." The creature that had once been a figment of his imagination, a shadow born of his deepest fears, was becoming real. It was growing stronger with each passing second, feeding off his suffering, his regret. He could feel it, a pulsing energy in the air, like the heartbeat of some ancient forgotten god. And worse, he could feel that it wasn't alone. There were others, unseen, waiting, watching, listening for the right moment to strike. Suddenly the ground beneath him cracked open. The air turned ice cold, and with a sickening lurch, Elliot felt himself falling. No, plummeting into an abyss so vast, so deep, it seemed to swallow all light, all sound, all hope. His stomach lurched as the ground disappeared, leaving him suspended in a void of pure blackness. His scream echoed into the silence, but it was quickly swallowed by the endless emptiness. And then he stopped falling. The force that had yanked him into the void had suddenly released him, leaving him weightless, floating in a cold, suffocating darkness. His eyes scanned the space around him, but there was nothing. Only an endless stretch of inky blackness that seemed to devour everything. Was this it? He wondered. Was this the end? The voices were still there, swirling around him in a maddening cacophony. Some of them sounded like whispers, others like screams, others still like guttural growls, like beasts lurking just out of sight. He couldn't tell where they were coming from. They seemed to surround him, closing in, tightening their grip. Then a figure appeared. At first, it was only a blur, a silhouette against the absolute blackness. But as it moved closer, it sharpened into something recognizably human, yet not. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its body too thin, gaunt and skeletal. The skin was pale, stretched tightly over bone, almost translucent in the dim light. Its face was a blank canvas, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface where a human face should be. But the thing's presence, the weight of it, was undeniable. It radiated power, malevolence, something primal. Elliot's heart lurched in his chest, the terror building once more, clawing at his throat. It moved closer, but each step it took felt like an eternity. And as it drew nearer, Elliot could see the fine details, sharp, jagged lines etched into its pale skin, like cracks spreading across a shattered mirror. The creature stopped in front of him, Elliot's breath caught in his throat, his body trembling with a primal fear that he could not control. And then it spoke. "You created me," it said, its voice like a whisper of death, soft but infinitely threatening. "You gave me form. You gave me life." Elliot's eyes widened in horror. No, I didn't mean to." "You did," the creature hissed, its featureless face tilting to one side, as if studying him. "You wanted to be free. You wanted power. You wanted control over life, over death. But you misunderstood the cost." Elliot swallowed, a lump forming in his throat. His entire body shook with fear, but he couldn't look away. He had done this. He had opened the door, created the thing standing before him. And now it was too late. There was no undoing what had been done. The creature's thin arms reached out slowly, its fingers long and sharp, like claws of a predator. It touched Elliot's forehead, and a jolt of electricity surged through his body. His vision blurred, and for a brief moment he thought he could hear the whispers again, louder now, all around him, inside him, drowning him. "You will understand soon," the creature whispered, its voice growing deeper, more resonant, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "You will feel everything I feel. You will know the pain of creation, the torment of existence." And then, everything went dark. Chapter 6. The Hollow Reflection. Elliot's eyes fluttered open, but the world that greeted him was not the one he had known. The cold blackness was still there, lingering like a suffocating fog, yet something was different. The familiar whispers, the countless, unrelenting whispers, had faded, replaced by a dead silence that felt even more oppressive. He tried to move, but his limbs felt as though they were made of lead, sluggish, uncooperative. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight with an anxiety he couldn't shake. "Where am I?" The question echoed in his mind, but it didn't come with the hope of an answer. His surroundings were an endless void, stretching far beyond his sight. His body felt detached, like it didn't belong to him, as though he were drifting in some in-between state, between the living world and something far worse. As Elliot struggled to orient himself, the silence around him fractured with a single, sharp sound, a crack, like the breaking of glass. He turned his head instinctively toward the noise, though there was nothing to see in the blackness. The crack grew louder, more frequent, until it became a constant, high-pitched shriek, like the sound of thin metal being bent out of shape. Elliot's heart raced, and a new wave of fear struck him, more powerful than any he had felt before. It was the same sensation he had felt the first time he realized what he had done. The same primal terror that he would never escape his creation. It was the sound of reality itself breaking down. Then, the world shifted. With a sudden and violent lurch, the nothingness around Elliot began to warp, twisting and undulating like a living thing. The void cracked open like an egg, revealing something beneath. A place, a space that felt familiar. An image began to form, blurry at first, but quickly sharpening. He could see a room, though not one he recognized. It was dark, the air thick with an oppressive heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the stone as if they had been carved by a force far older than man. The air smelled of decay, of something rotting just out of sight. But worse still, it smelled of memory, of forgotten things, of past sins that had never been laid to rest. Elliot's pulse quickened as he realized what he was seeing. His own reflection, but not the reflection he was used to. This was something different. In the darkened room, his face stared back at him, but it was wrong. His eyes were hollow, sunken into his skull. The skin stretched tight over bone. His mouth was twisted into an expression of agony. His lips pulled back to reveal jagged teeth, some of them broken, others too long, too sharp. His face seemed to be melting, the features warping and shifting as if they were made of liquid. Elliot tried to scream, but no sound came. The reflection only smirked, a wicked grin stretching impossibly wide across his face. It was his face, but distorted, a grotesque parody of the man he had once been. The image of him in the mirror seemed to shift with a life of its own, its eyes following him no matter where he moved. It leaned forward, its eyes widening as if it recognized something deeper within him. "You still don't understand, do you?" it whispered, the words sliding across his mind like a snake's tongue. "You can never escape what you've become." Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as a wave of vertigo struck him. His head spun, and the room seemed to tilt, as if it were falling. The walls were bending, warping, and then they cracked open completely, revealing what lay beyond. Another world, one that was even darker, more twisted. It was a place where shadows danced like living things, where the air was thick with the smell of iron and rot. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. The darkness behind him shifted, and the faint sound of something skittering, scratching, echoed in the air. Elliot turned, his body moving against his will, and saw them. Eyes. Hundreds, thousands of eyes, glowing in the dark, peering out from every shadow. They were not human eyes. No, these were eyes of something far older, far darker. Their gaze pierced through him, through his very soul, and Elliot felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The eyes belonged to something else, a collection of spirits, of creatures that had existed before the world had even begun. As the eyes closed in, Elliot's body grew cold, paralyzed by fear. And then they spoke. "You opened the door," they said, their voices 1,000 broken whispers blending into one. "And now you must pay the price." The ground beneath him trembled as if the earth itself was alive, shifting and groaning in pain. Elliot's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor. His mind reeled as he tried to grasp the enormity of what was happening. He had done this. All of it. The creation, the opening of the door, the summoning of whatever these things were. Suddenly, everything went dark again. The hollow reflection was no longer just an image. It was a warning. When Elliot opened his eyes once more, he found himself standing in a room that felt like his own. Yet it was completely foreign. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, just like the room from before. But now they pulsed with a faint, eerie light. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, a buzzing hum that filled the space like a swarm of unseen insects. At the center of the room was a pedestal, ancient and covered in dust. Upon it sat an object, a small, intricately carved box, dark and gleaming in the strange light. Elliot didn't need to be told what it was. He knew. He had seen it before, in his nightmares. The box, the key to everything, the source of his creation. He stumbled toward it, his body trembling as if it were not his own, as if some unseen force was guiding him. His hand reached out without his consent, hovering above the box, trembling with dread. But the moment his fingers brushed its surface, a shock of cold shot through his body, and he was pulled backward, crashing into the wall. The box did not move, but something else did. From the darkness of the room, a figure appeared, tall, shadowy and looming. It was familiar, though Elliot could not place it. It stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and he recognized the form, the creature that had been haunting him all this time. The creature stood in the shadows, its form barely visible. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the very air was bending around it. And then it spoke. "You think you can control it." The creature's voice was low, growling. "But you can't. You opened the door. You called us into this world. And now we own you." Elliot opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips. There was no defending himself. He knew what he had done, and there was no way to undo it. The creature's grin widened, its face flickering between grotesque smiles and terrifying emptiness. It stepped closer, and Elliot could feel the air growing colder, denser, as though it were being consumed by the darkness. "You have become part of us," the creature whispered, "and you will never escape." Chapter 7. The Echoes of Silence. Elliot's vision was fragmented, a shifting kaleidoscope of shapes and shadows. For a moment, he thought he had awoken in a different place. But the walls around him, cold and unyielding, were unmistakable. His body trembled as he slowly took in his surroundings. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness that gripped his lungs. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your eardrums, making the very act of breathing feel like an intrusion. He had been here before. Not physically, no. But in the deepest, darkest corners of his mind, in the prison he had created for himself, this place was all too familiar. The same sense of dread, the same suffocating pressure. It was as if the very room had been constructed from the fragments of his worst fears, shaped into a space where nothing could escape, where nothing could be forgotten. The walls were lined with mirrors, but they were not ordinary mirrors. These were warped, jagged, as if the glass had been stretched and bent against its will. They reflected not just his physical form, but something darker, something that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. His reflection, when he dared to look, was not his own. His face was distorted, stretched too thin, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his mouth a grotesque mask of silent screams. He recoiled from the sight, but the mirrors seemed to follow him, their eyes too real, too alive. "You cannot hide," they whispered. The words slithered through the air like worms wriggling beneath the surface of the ground. He stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind, once a place of rationality and logic, now felt like a disjointed puzzle, a chaotic mess of fragmented thoughts and memories. Nothing made sense anymore. Every step he took was like moving through thick molasses, each action weighed down by a force greater than his will. There were voices now. Soft whispers at first, barely audible, like a distant murmur through the wall. Then they grew louder, clearer, until they filled the room, coming from all directions at once. They were not human voices, though. No, these were the voices of something much older, much more sinister. They spoke in a language that Elliot could not understand, but their tone, harsh, guttural, and filled with malevolent intent, needed no translation. They were waiting for him. Elliot's chest tightened, and a wave of nausea surged through him. The room felt smaller, closing in on him with each passing second. The mirrors seemed to ripple, their surfaces becoming slick with some dark fluid, a black ichor that pooled at the base of the glass. As he watched, a hand, no, not a hand, but something more twisted, more grotesque, emerged from the liquid. It was long, spindly, covered in what looked like cracked, diseased skin. The fingers were too long, reaching out toward him like a spider's legs, twitching and jerking with unnatural movement. Elliot froze, unable to look away as the hand slowly reached for him. His legs screamed in protest, demanding that he move, but his body was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by fear. The hand crept closer. The smell of decay filled the air, thick and putrid, as though something ancient and foul was crawling through the walls. The fingers touched the mirror's surface, leaving a trail of slick, oily residue in their wake. Then, with a sharp, piercing crack, the mirror shattered. It didn't fall to the ground. No, the shards hovered in the air, suspended in a way that defied all logic. Slowly, one by one, the shards of glass began to spin, each reflecting a different version of himself, a different Elliot, each one worse than the last. Some were smiling cruelly, others crying in agony, still others frozen in blank, empty stares. But all of them shared one thing in common, a look of absolute emptiness. The air turned frigid, and Elliot could feel his breath coming out in visible plumes of mist. A deep, resonant sound filled the room, like a bell tolling from the deepest recesses of hell. His heart hammered in his chest, but his feet remained frozen in place, unable to move, unable to escape the suffocating grip of the shadows that now seemed to gather around him. He tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive air. There were no words, no sound, only the steady, drumming rhythm of his heartbeat, louder and louder until it seemed to drown out everything else. The mirrors shifted again, their edges cracking as something began to emerge from them. The reflection, the true reflection, was not his own. The figure that appeared was tall, gaunt, its skin pale as death, stretched tight over its bones. Its face was devoid of features, save for a single hollow black eye that seemed to stare straight into Elliot's soul. The other eye was a twisted, gaping hole, a hollow that threatened to swallow everything in its path. "You thought you could forget me?" the thing hissed, its voice a distorted, rasping growl that rattled Elliot's bones. "You thought you could escape?" Elliot tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The room was infinite, stretching outward in all directions, and the mirrors multiplied, reflecting endless versions of the creature. It surrounded him, closing in from every angle. "You made me," the creature continued, its voice no longer a whisper, but a thunderous roar that filled the space. "You gave me form, gave me life, and now I will feed." The mirrors began to crack even more violently, their edges splintering and breaking, the shards splintering into hundreds of sharp pieces that glimmered with malice. And then, the creature's mouth, the only feature that seemed to form on its face, split open in a grotesque, inhuman grin. "You cannot hide," it repeated, its voice echoing in his skull. "You are mine." Elliot felt something stir inside him, a sickening, nauseating feeling that made his stomach turn. A deep, primal fear flooded through his veins, and for the first time since all of this began, he realized something truly terrible. He was not the creator. He was the creation. He had been built for this very moment. His existence had been forged not to control, but to be controlled. A single shard of glass, the sharpest, the deadliest, rose from the shattered pile and hovered in front of him. It was sharp enough to slice through bone, through soul. It drew closer, inch by agonizing inch. Elliot could feel the sharp point against his chest, pressing against his skin, feeling like the end, like the point where his existence would be severed from the world. But he couldn't move. His body was paralyzed, consumed by the unrelenting fear that had taken root in his soul. His mind was caught in an endless loop of what-ifs. What if he couldn't stop it? What if this was the end? And then, with a sudden and deafening crack, the glass shattered completely. A blast of wind tore through the room, ripping apart the mirrors, the walls, everything. The creature howled, its form shattering into countless pieces, each piece vanishing into the dark ether. The room began to collapse, and Elliot felt himself falling deeper into the void. The darkness swallowed him whole, and he was lost. Chapter 7. The Echoes of Silence. Part 2. The wind, sharp and biting, carried with it an eerie whisper, a sound like the rustling of dry leaves scraping across the forest floor. It filled his ears, louder now, ringing with an unnatural intensity. Elliot couldn't tell whether it was the wind itself or the creature's voice. Was it speaking again, or was it simply the remnants of its madness seeping into his consciousness? His chest constricted, and for a moment he thought he might suffocate in the oppressive silence that followed the shattering of the mirrors. But the silence wasn't quiet. It was a dead silence, thick with the weight of a presence that pressed on him, crawling beneath his skin. As the darkness closed around him, Elliot struggled to find his bearings. His vision blurred. He could no longer see the room, the mirrors, or even the air he had once breathed with such abandon. Everything was consumed by the void. There was no floor beneath him, no walls pressing in from all sides. There was only the infinite swirling blackness, a cavernous, disorienting space that threatened to swallow him whole. And yet, despite the profound lack of any clear direction, Elliot knew that he was not alone. Not anymore. He could feel it. The creature's presence was heavy in the air, its malignant energy reverberating in every corner of his mind. The space around him pulsed, an invisible rhythm, like the beat of a heart that wasn't his own. The whispers returned, distorted, frantic now, fragmented phrases that gnawed at his sanity. You cannot escape. It's too late for you. You are the one who made me. Elliot's knees buckled, and he dropped into the darkness. His body jerked and tumbled, as though gravity no longer obeyed the laws of physics. He couldn't control his descent, couldn't stop the pull of the abyss that had opened up beneath him. He reached out, instinctively, his hands grasping for anything that might anchor him in this endless fall. His fingertips scraped against something cold, smooth, slick. Glass. The shards. The mirrors. His breath hitched as he realized that he was not alone in this fall. He wasn't drifting through the emptiness at all. He was plummeting toward something. A force, a presence, a place where the boundaries between what was real and what was imagined had long since dissolved. His outstretched hands closed around the shards, and as they did, they seemed to respond, vibrating, pulsating with an energy that wasn't his own. It was as though the shards were alive, like they had been waiting for him. Then came the voices. They filled his head, whispers growing into screams, incomprehensible and maddening. The glass shattered again. Only this time, it wasn't the room around him that cracked. It was his own mind. He was breaking, splintering into pieces, as if every mirror, every reflection, was digging deeper into his consciousness. You can't outrun me, Elliot. You cannot undo what you've done. You are mine. The words became claws, sharp and biting, tearing through the fragile fabric of his sanity. The creature's presence grew, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread, an unbearable pressure that seemed to press in from every side. His skin crawled as if something was moving beneath it. Something inside him was changing. And then, the echoes began to take shape. From the void, from the very fabric of the darkness, figures began to emerge, shifting, flickering, indistinct at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. They were tall, silhouetted against the inky blackness, their bodies broken, their faces twisted. Some were humanoid, others were not. Some seemed to be moving toward him, while others recoiled as though avoiding his gaze. They were all there. Fragments of his memories, pieces of his past, warped and distorted by the creature's power. There were faces he knew, faces of people he had long since forgotten, people who had vanished from his life, parents, old friends, even the strangers he'd passed on the street. But now, their faces were marred, stretched, pulled into grotesque parodies of the people they once were. Their eyes were hollow, black voids, like the eye of the creature itself. Elliot recoiled, but it was as if the air around him was alive, shifting, tightening. He couldn't escape their gaze. They reached for him with arms that were too long, too thin. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out. They didn't need to speak. You are one of us now. It was a thought, a pulse that moved through his mind like a whisper that wasn't his own. But it felt like it came from the depths of the void, from the very creature that had followed him here. The realization hit him hard. These were not just reflections. They were manifestations of everything he had ever done, everything he had ever feared. These were the consequences of his actions, twisted and alive. The darkness began to shift again. The figures merged, a writhing mass of limbs and faces that came together in a terrible, monstrous whole. It was not a single entity anymore. It was 1,000 fragments of Elliot's own soul, stitched together by the creature's will. The boundaries between what was real and what was not had long since dissolved. He had become part of this nightmarish world, a creation of his own making. Look at what you've done, Elliot. The words were no longer whispered. They were screamed in his mind, an all-consuming roar that shattered the last of his resolve. And then the faces, the hundreds of faces, turned toward him in unison. Their hollow eyes locked on him, empty but somehow aware, and Elliot felt a cold, bone-deep chill seep into his very marrow. He could feel their hunger. The shadows around him thickened, spiraling toward him like ink in water. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, crushing, until it felt as though the very air had turned to liquid, drowning him. The faces twisted and contorted, their mouths stretching open impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, teeth that were too many, too sharp, too hungry. Elliot screamed. He didn't even know he was screaming, but the sound filled the void, a cry that was swallowed up immediately by the silence. There was no escape from this place, no refuge, no hope. He had created this world. He had summoned the darkness with his own hand, and now it was coming for him. The last thing he saw before the darkness overwhelmed him was the creature's face, a hollow, featureless thing, looming above him like a giant shadow. Its eyes were black voids, sucking in the light. And as it gazed down at him, Elliot heard the final whisper in his mind. "You will never leave." The void swallowed him whole. Chapter 8. The Hollow Echoes of Tomorrow. Part 1. Elliot awoke in darkness. Not the comforting darkness of sleep, but a deep, oppressive void that clung to him like wet cloth, smothering his every breath. The air around him was thick, humid with a stifling, metallic scent that made his stomach churn. His eyes, wide and unblinking, adjusted to the blackness, though the effort felt useless. There was no detail, no shape or shadow, just the feeling of being submerged in something too vast to comprehend. He stood, or at least he thought he stood. His legs felt like jelly, his body heavy, as though gravity had become an enemy. The world around him was silent, so silent that the quiet itself screamed in his ears. Every movement he made was slow, as if the air itself resisted him, forcing him to fight for each step. As he staggered forward, Elliot's mind raced. His thoughts swirled, and he grasped for any anchor to tether him to reality. But it slipped through his fingers like smoke. The faces, the thousands of faces, haunted his every thought, and though he tried to push them away, they lingered in the corners of his mind. He remembered their hollow, empty eyes, their twisted expressions as they reached out toward him, the gnashing of their teeth. "You cannot escape. You are here forever." He didn't know what they meant, or if they even were real. Maybe it was just the madness settling in. Maybe he had crossed some invisible line between this world and the one that had been waiting for him all along. Perhaps this place, this never-ending darkness, was all he would ever know from now on. Suddenly, he felt it. A movement in the shadows, something shifting, pulling at the fabric of the void. His pulse quickened as he spun, desperately trying to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. But there was nothing to see, just the darkness, but it was there. Something in the air hummed now, vibrating with the same malicious energy that had infected him ever since the mirrors had shattered. Something was here, something far worse than what he had imagined in his worst nightmares. A presence, immense and cold, like the deep ocean, the space between stars, reaching into his chest, suffocating him with an ancient, suffocating force. "Hello?" His voice barely broke through the silence, a thin and fragile thing that seemed to dissolve the moment it left his lips. No answer. Of course, there was none. He reached out into the blackness, fingers trembling, but found nothing but emptiness. His breath was ragged now, and he could feel his pulse thrumming in his temples, in his throat, in his chest. Every heartbeat was a drumbeat in the silence, echoing too loud, too relentlessly. Then, he felt it, a cold draft, rushing from somewhere behind him. It was not like any wind he had ever known. It wasn't the soothing kind that whispers through trees, or the sharp bite of a storm. This wind, it was unnatural. It carried with it the scent of decay, the smell of something long dead and forgotten, of graveyards and old forgotten homes that had been abandoned for years. The wind swept past him with an almost purposeful intent, making his skin prickle. It passed without sound, but Elliot could feel its weight, the unseen force of its presence. And in the instant before it disappeared, before the world around him returned to its crushing silence, Elliot saw it. Just a flicker, A glimpse, like a light too faint to catch, something moving, just out of the corner of his eye. He whirled around and the darkness seemed to shudder, to recoil from his frantic movement. But there was nothing. He was alone. And yet, he could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, their presence like 1,000 heavy hands pressing down on his shoulders. A sensation of dread washed over him, not just fear, but a deeper, bone-shattering terror, a terror that reached into the very marrow of his being. He wasn't alone. Elliot took a cautious step back, his body trembling, mind clawing to make sense of what was happening. And then, the voice came, a voice he recognized, but one he had never expected to hear again. Elliot. His heart slammed against his ribs, a rush of panic clawing at his throat. The voice, the sound, was so familiar, but it had no shape, no mouth to form it. It was the voice of someone he had known long ago, someone he thought was gone forever. He knew that voice. He should have known that voice. But where was it coming from? The sound reverberated through his skull, bouncing from one side to the other, scraping against the inside of his mind. "Who's there?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. It was like a cry lost in the abyss. "You know who I am." The voice lingered, pulling at the edges of his sanity, stretching it thin. The words were so simple, but they carried a weight that made him stumble, his knees buckling under the strain. His breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered. "No, it can't be. You called me here." The voice was colder now, sharper, as though something more sinister had taken over its tone. "You brought me into this place, and now I will never leave." He froze. His mind churned in agony as the realization hit him like a physical blow. The creature, the one that had been stalking him from the moment he had broken the mirror, wasn't just some nightmare. It wasn't something he could dismiss as figments of his imagination. It was real. And worse still, he had summoned it. He had opened the door, drawn it into this world, and now there was no way to escape it. Suddenly, the air around him grew heavy, thickening with something palpable, something that pressed in from all sides. The wind had returned, but this time it wasn't a mere draft. It was a force, a living, breathing presence. He could feel it swirling around him, pulling at his clothes, tangling his hair, whispering his name. He reached out, instinctively, his hand trembling as he stretched it into the oppressive blackness, hoping to feel something solid, something real, but the darkness swallowed his hand whole. There was nothing, and then, just as he thought he might lose himself completely to the void, a light appeared. It was faint, barely perceptible at first, a single flickering flame. It was dim, struggling to push through the suffocating darkness. It grew larger, stronger, until it filled the space around him with a sickly, yellowish glow. It was not the warm, comforting light of a candle or a lantern. This light was wrong. It was a light that should not exist in a place like this. The flicker of the flame revealed the faintest outline of a face, but it wasn't human. The face that appeared was twisted, contorted, a grotesque mockery of something that had once been alive. Eyes too wide, skin too stretched, lips curling back in a grin that was far too sharp. It wasn't just a face, though. It was a mask that had been worn over and over again for countless years. A mask that had been carved from the very essence of fear, the face of terror itself. And it was looking straight at Elliot. Part 2. Elliot's heart raced, each beat like thunder in his chest, as the flickering, sickly yellow glow from the creature's face cast long, trembling shadows across the empty void. The air seemed to thicken, the weight of its presence settling around him like a suffocating shroud. The face, the mask, stared back at him, its hollow eyes piercing through the darkness, and a slow, jagged grin spread across its features, like a jagged crack splitting the stillness. He stumbled back, his legs shaking beneath him as though they had turned to stone. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind screaming for him to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness pressed in from all sides, as if the very space around him had been consumed by the thing that loomed before him. "It knows," the thought echoed in his mind, the terrifying realization sinking in like a stone. "It knows what I've done." The face twisted, its expression shifting with a mocking ease. The eyes, those unnaturally wide, unblinking eyes, shifted, narrowing with malicious intent. A voice whispered from its depths, like 1,000 voices in unison, their words distorting the air, warping reality. "You cannot hide from me," it hissed, the sound like broken glass scraping against stone. "You called me here. Now you are mine." Elliot could feel the air growing colder, the temperature plummeting as the words sank into his bones, chilling him from the inside out. His mind reeled, unable to process the enormity of the entity before him. How had he done this? How had he opened the door to something so wrong? "It's not real," he told himself, but the words felt hollow. He could see it. He could feel it. This thing, this face of fear was real, and it was here to claim him. His body moved on instinct. He turned, his feet slamming against the ground as he tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the very air itself was pushing back against him. The creature's laughter followed him, an unsettling sound that reverberated through the void, clawing at his ears, drowning out everything else. It was like a dark melody, twisted and wrong, but it pulled at him, drawing him deeper into its grasp. "You will never escape," the voice echoed in his mind, each word seeping into his thoughts, burrowing under his skin. Elliot's pulse hammered in his throat as he stumbled, his vision blurring, the darkness closing in around him. He couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. All he could hear was the laughter, that terrifying, mocking laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He collapsed to the ground, his breath shallow, his body shaking uncontrollably. His fingers dug into the cold, smooth surface beneath him, as though grasping for something, anything, that could ground him. But there was nothing. No solid surface. No way out. "I should have never done it," he thought, his mind spiraling into panic. "I never should have looked into it. I never should have—" The words were stolen from his mind as a sharp, searing pain shot through his chest. Elliot gasped, his hands clutching his sides as the pain twisted deeper, as though something inside him was being torn apart. His breath hitched, the weight of it making his ribs feel like they were splintering. It felt like every inch of him was being crushed under the weight of the world, as though the very essence of his being was being ripped from him. And then, the whisper came again, not from the creature's mouth, but from the very air around him. "It's too late." The words reverberated through him like a curse. The pain stopped as abruptly as it had begun, but the damage was done. He could feel it. Deep within, beneath the layers of flesh and bone, something was wrong. Something was pulling at his soul, like an anchor being tied to the bottom of a dark, cold ocean. And it wasn't letting go. The laughter was back, louder now, more insistent, swirling around him like a storm. The face, the mask, was still there, its eyes staring down at him with unblinking hatred. But now, it wasn't just a face. It was the embodiment of every nightmare he had ever had, every fear he had ever known. It was the thing that haunted him, that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. "You will be mine," it crooned, the voice dripping with malice. "All of you." Elliot's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision swimming. His heart pounded painfully in his chest, and his thoughts felt like they were breaking apart at the edges, scattered like shards of glass. He couldn't think, couldn't reason. The weight of the presence before him was suffocating, consuming everything. It was taking him. His mind screamed for him to fight, to resist, but there was nothing left. No strength, no will, only the endless, suffocating pull of the darkness and the cold, empty laughter that echoed in his ears. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The air, thick and oppressive just moments before, now felt unnervingly still. The dark presence that had surrounded him was gone, and with it, the voice, the laughter. It was as if the creature had simply disappeared into the void, leaving nothing behind but the hollow, aching emptiness. Elliot lay there, his body still trembling, his mind reeling. He blinked rapidly, his hands trembling as they pressed against the cold surface beneath him. His chest heaved with each shallow breath, but the pain, the weight, it was gone, but something had changed. He could feel it. It wasn't just the physical world that had shifted. It was him. Something deep within him had been altered. And it wasn't just his mind that had fractured. He had become something else. Something he couldn't name. The touch of the creature, the weight of its presence, had left a scar on his soul. A mark that would never fade. And now, the darkness had returned. But this time, it wasn't just surrounding him. It was inside him. A whisper slid through his mind. A thought that wasn't his own, but one he had heard before, echoing from the void. "You are mine now." Elliot's eyes snapped open, but the void remained, consuming him from the inside out. Chapter 9. The Veil of Hollow Faces. The oppressive stillness of the room seemed to breathe with him. Elliot sat on the cold, damp floor, his hands trembling, a bead of sweat rolling down his forehead. The shadows that once seemed so far away now closed in on him like a suffocating fog. The world outside his mind no longer felt real, as if it had dissolved into an endless haze of nightmare. He had done this. He had opened the door. There was no going back, no remedy, no escape. Elliot's thoughts were fractured. His every sense was assaulted by the strange humming, the hollow echoes that reverberated in his skull like the ringing of a bell. Something deep and ancient, something far older than him, than this house, than the world itself. The presence was still there. Its cold fingers had long since twisted themselves into the very marrow of his bones. He could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. "You are mine now." The voice had echoed in his mind 100 times, each iteration a bit more detached, more mocking. It was no longer something he could escape, no longer a fear he could outrun. Brises, it had taken something from him, but it wasn't the skin, nor the soul. It had taken his reality, his very essence, and wrapped it into something new, something unfathomable. It was like a sickness, slowly feeding, spreading, taking root. The more Elliot tried to understand, the more lost he became. His memories seemed to fade like mist in the wind, each second disintegrating into another. He looked around the room, trying to focus. The walls, those familiar, mundane walls of his childhood home, were no longer comforting. They had warped into something alien, the edges of the wood curling and bending like they were made of flesh. The corners of the room seemed to pulse with some sort of sickening life, shadows flickering like disjointed thoughts. Is this real? Elliot squeezed his eyes shut, desperately trying to regain control of his thoughts. But when he opened them, the world seemed to bend further. His hands were pale, stretched, unnaturally long, their fingertips almost touching the ceiling, as though the room itself was growing taller to accommodate the changes that were overtaking him. He stood up with great difficulty, the floor beneath him giving way with every step. His feet felt heavy, his legs like lead. He could barely keep his balance, his vision blurring. "It's the sickness," he thought desperately. "It's the thing inside me, inside my mind." He stumbled toward the door, but as his hand touched the cold brass handle, the door seemed to melt before his very eyes. The wood softened like wet clay, distorting into shapes he couldn't understand. Desperate, he recoiled, but the door dissolved entirely, leaving only a yawning void in front of him. Behind him, the air seemed to grow colder still. He heard the creak of floorboards that weren't there before, the subtle, almost imperceptible sound of movement. A low whisper reverberated through the walls, and with it came the unmistakable scent of decay. "You can never leave." The voice was no longer coming from the depths of his mind. It was around him, behind him, in him. The air grew heavier, thick with malice. His breath quickened. The walls, the very space around him, pulsed with a malevolent rhythm. It was as if the house itself had turned against him, like it was hungry for his fear. Elliot's head snapped around. There was something there, something just out of his line of sight. He turned to face it, his stomach lurching with dread. The creature wasn't visible at first, but its presence was undeniable. The walls shuddered as if they could barely contain the growing nightmare that was pressing in from all sides. The air seemed to hum with a strange energy, an almost electric crackle of fear, a static charge that filled the room with unholy tension. Suddenly, a face appeared, or rather a mask. the hollow eyes, the jagged grin that stretched impossibly wide, as though mocking him. Elliot's heart slammed into his chest as the face began to form, twisting out of the air like smoke solidifying into something tangible. The mask was both ancient and new, made of something that felt both living and dead. It had no skin, no pores, just a smooth porcelain surface cracked in jagged lines. It was somehow human but distorted beyond comprehension. Features familiar, yet not quite right. Its eyes, those wide, empty holes, stared at him with a cold, knowing hunger. The room grew even colder. Elliot's breath was a visible mist in front of him. The mask didn't move, but somehow Elliot could feel it staring at him. It was aware of him, and then the voice. An oily, whispering hiss that crawled under his skin broke the silence. "You think you can escape, but you can never run from me." Elliot stepped back, a scream building in his throat, but his voice was gone, swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees, unable to tear his eyes away from the mask. It was so close now. He could see every crack, every imperfection, the faintest shimmer of light reflecting off the surface of the mask, like the faint gleam of polished bone. He could hear his heartbeat, rapid and shallow, in his ears. His hands trembled uncontrollably at his sides, as though his own body was betraying him. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged, only the oppressive silence that had descended upon him like a shroud. The mask leaned in closer, its empty eyes staring into him, through him, until he could feel the cold fingers of its gaze wrapped around his very soul. And then it began to speak again. "You were foolish to think you could escape me. Now you belong to me, body, soul, and mind." The words echoed in his mind like the toll of a bell, reverberating against the very core of his being. Elliot's vision blurred, his thoughts unraveling, his consciousness slipping from his grasp. You will never be free again. A horrible realization struck him with such force that it nearly shattered his sanity. It's not just the house. It's not just the mask. It's me. Everything he had feared, every shadow that had haunted him, had been nothing compared to this. It was as though the mask had peeled away the very fabric of reality, exposing something far darker, far older than anything he could comprehend. And it had always been there, waiting for him to open the door, waiting for him to make the mistake. "Welcome," the voice whispered, its tone low and cruel, "to eternity." The mask smiled. The darkness swallowed him whole. Chapter 9. The Veil of Hollow Faces, Part 2. Elliot's body trembled as he sank deeper into the darkness. His mind screamed for release, but it was as if the air itself had become a weight that pressed against him from every angle. The mask, the thing that had no name, loomed ever closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him with an unyielding gaze, searching for something deep within him. It could feel him, his terror, his dread, like a fragrance in the air that clung to everything he was. He could feel his thoughts splintering, being pulled away from him, piece by piece, as though the mask was draining him of his very essence. The house around him had shifted. It was no longer the familiar, dilapidated home he had once known. The walls were now alive, pulsing with a rhythm of their own. They seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, like the chest of a great, slumbering beast. The ceiling hung lower, the floorboards groaning under invisible weight. The house itself had become a trap, a tomb. It was as though the building had become an extension of the mask, of the entity that was now consuming him. Elliot's breathing quickened, his pulse thundering in his ears, his hands, slick with cold sweat, clenched into fists as he tried to push himself away from the floor. But there was no escape. He could feel the mask's presence as if it were already inside his skull, twisting his thoughts, pulling them in every direction. Every instinct he had told him to run, to scream, to fight. But those feelings, those actions, were no longer within his reach. He opened his mouth to scream, but the words came out as nothing more than a strangled whisper, the sound thick and suffocated. The mask leaned in closer, its porcelain surface reflecting the faint light of the room. Its grin impossibly wide, stretching unnaturally. The edges of its smile seemed to blur and distort, as though the mask itself was struggling to contain the darkness behind it. "You can't run from me, Elliot." The voice whispered, low and chilling, but it wasn't just in his ears. It was in his mind, threading through his thoughts like a vine wrapping tighter and tighter around his consciousness. Elliot shuddered, his eyes desperately searching the room, but it was all wrong. The walls were beginning to distort, as if they were liquefying, sliding into one another. The boundaries of the room were no longer fixed, and the floor beneath him swelled and twisted. His body felt heavy, weighted down by something that wasn't there. The world was collapsing, folding in on itself, and with each breath, he was being swallowed further. "You are nothing." The voice came again, its tone like the rattle of dry bones. An empty vessel, a hollow shell. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear his eyes away from the mask, to find the strength to move, but his body refused to obey. His vision blurred, the air thickening with an unbearable pressure. The mask's hollow eyes, cold and unfeeling, pierced into his very soul. It was as though the mask was alive, feeding off his fear, his despair, but there was something else. Something deeper beneath the mask's eerie presence. It wasn't just the thing that wore it. It was the truth that the mask held. The horror behind it was older than the house, older than time itself. It was a void that consumed everything, a force that took not just the body, but the mind. The veil of reality was slipping away. Elliot could no longer distinguish where his thoughts ended and where the mask began. The boundaries were dissolving. He was becoming it. The mask's grin widened impossibly, stretching to the point where Elliot thought it might split in two. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished, disappearing into thin air. Elliot gasped for breath, his eyes snapping open. His heart was pounding in his chest, his body soaked with sweat. "It's not real," he thought, desperately trying to regain control. "I need to wake up. This is just a dream." But the oppressive atmosphere remained. The house was silent now, eerily so. The pulse of the walls had stopped. The darkness that had once closed in around him was gone, leaving an unnatural stillness in its place. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing. Just the same decaying walls, the same rotting wood. He wiped his forehead with a shaking hand, staring at the remnants of the empty space. The mask had disappeared, but the feeling of its presence was still there, lingering like the aftertaste of something bitter. He stood slowly, his legs weak beneath him. His mind felt heavy, like it was clouded with thick fog, and the familiar surroundings of the house felt wrong. The air tasted like metal, a sharp tang that burned his tongue. Suddenly, a low creak echoed through the silence. Elliot froze, his heart skipping a beat. His breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted toward the source of the sound. A door, ajar at the far end of the room, was now slowly swinging open by itself. The hinges squeaked as the door moved, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to carry with it a warning. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to go toward it, but his feet moved of their own accord. He felt as though something was pulling him toward the door, like an invisible force was guiding him. The sense of dread only grew stronger as he neared it, the darkness beyond the threshold seeming to beckon him. Elliot reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the door. The moment his fingers brushed the cold wood, a violent rush of air swept through the room, slamming the door wide open with an almost deafening force. The gust of wind knocked Elliot off balance, but he managed to steady himself, his heart racing in his chest. What lay beyond the door was not what he expected. It was not another room, another hallway. It was nothing. A void, an endless abyss of swirling shadows that seemed to pulse with life. The darkness beckoned to him, swallowing up everything in its path. "It's waiting," Elliot realized, his stomach churning. He had to resist, but it was as if the darkness was drawing him in, sucking him closer with every breath he took. And then, as he stared into the infinite blackness, a voice broke the silence. "Elliot, you belong to us now." The voice was not the mask's this time. It was deeper, older, more familiar. The shadows began to move, writhing like living things, pulling themselves together into the shape of a figure. Elliot's heart stopped as the figure stepped out of the darkness, its face obscured by shadows. It was a face he knew, a face he had once loved, a face he would never see again. "You can never leave." And then the shadows enveloped him. Chapter 10. The last whisper of fear. The world beyond the door was no longer recognizable. It was an ocean of shadows, vast, endless, and alive. Elliot's mind screamed in protest as he stepped forward, his body moving without his command, driven by a force far stronger than fear. It was as though the air itself was bending to some unspeakable will, pulling him, urging him onward. Every step was heavier than the last, each movement an act of defiance against the suffocating weight of the darkness that pressed against him. His eyes, wide with horror, tried desperately to make sense of the space around him, but there was nothing to cling to. No structure, no form, just the undulating blackness that seemed to stretch for infinity. "Elliot!" The voice was soft, like a whisper lost in the wind, but it held a power that shook him to his core. His name, spoken with such intimacy, such knowing. The darkness seemed to curl around it, making it a sound too perfect, too maddening to ignore. "This is not real," Elliot tried to convince himself, though the doubt gnawed at him. The pull of the darkness was suffocating, the silence deafening, but deep inside, he knew. This was no illusion, no dream. He wasn't lost in a nightmare. He was standing at the threshold of something far worse. The shadows before him shifted, swirling in on themselves like a living entity, and with it came the heavy, suffocating presence that filled the air. It was there, just beyond the edges of his vision. Something terrible, something ancient, waiting for him to step closer, to become a part of it. Elliot's hand trembled as he reached forward, his fingers brushing against the cool air. He felt the hum of something unseen, like static on the edge of perception, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. He could feel it then. The Watcher, the one who had been haunting him since he first laid eyes on that cursed mask. It wasn't just the mask that had drawn him here. It was something more. A presence that had always been there, always watching, always waiting. A memory surfaced in his mind, one long buried, flickering like a candle in the wind. A room, a face, and the sound of his own breath, ragged and desperate, the sound of his voice, screaming. "It's me," Elliot thought in a flash of realization. "I've been here before." His body recoiled at the thought, his heart pounding harder in his chest. He had seen this place. The darkness, the face. It was not a mask, it was something else entirely. The entity had been wearing the mask, using it as a tool, but it was the entity that he had been drawn to, that he had become a part of. The walls closed in, and with them came the tightening in his chest, a choking feeling, as if the air had turned to liquid and was now filling his lungs. He gasped, but no breath came. The shadows flickered, shifting like flames, and for a split second, he saw the outline of something moving just beyond the edge of the void. It was him. Elliot's knees buckled, sending him crashing to the ground. His head swam as he tried to push himself back to his feet. But it was no use. The presence was overwhelming now. It wasn't the mask. It wasn't the face. It was the emptiness, the endless void that had claimed him. His pulse thudded in his ears, too loud, too fast, and yet, underneath it, there was something else. A hum, a vibration that rattled his very bones. The darkness thickened, almost solidifying into shapes. Figures emerged from the void, pale and shapeless. They moved in a grotesque mimicry of life, their bodies warping, elongating, like creatures that had forgotten their forms. Lost to time and decay, they had no faces, only empty spaces where their eyes should have been. They reached for him, their long, elongated fingers stretching like skeletal hands in the dim, swirling light. Elliot struggled to rise, his hands shaking violently. He could hear the whispers now, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. They spoke in riddles, in voices that sounded as though they had not spoken in centuries. their words a strange, twisted language that sent a shiver down his spine. You belong to the void now. You belong to us. He shook his head violently, trying to block them out, but their words sunk deep into his mind, gnawing at his thoughts. You are not you anymore, they seemed to say. You are lost. The floor beneath him began to crack, and from the fissures, more of the shadowy figures poured forth, crawling, creeping toward him. He felt his mind unraveling, the threads of his sanity loosening as the whispers grew louder, more maddening. The room, the space, felt as though it were alive, breathing, shifting, swallowing him whole. A flicker of light pierced the void, a single burning thread of white that cut through the darkness. It was a faint glimmer at first, but it grew brighter, spreading, until it consumed everything in its path. The shadows recoiled, dissipating in the presence of the light, but the figures remained, circling, waiting for the inevitable. Elliot tried to move, to run, but his legs betrayed him. His body felt like it had turned to stone, paralyzed in the face of the growing light. And then, from the edge of his vision, he saw it, the mask. It wasn't just the mask of horror that he had once seen. It was the entity itself, the one that had been wearing the mask, the thing that had dragged him into this world. The mask was now fused with the darkness, the edges of it shifting and warping as though it were alive. It was not an object, it was a creature, a manifestation of terror itself, and it was staring at him, waiting. Elliot could feel the last of his will slipping away as the mask's gaze locked onto him. He could feel it pulling at him, sinking into his skin, burrowing deep into his soul. And then, for the first time, he heard the voice in his head, not as a whisper, but as a scream. You are mine. The ground cracked beneath him, the room spinning wildly, the figures, the shadows. They were all closing in now, a suffocating tide of cold, empty eyes and gaping mouths. The mask's grin twisted, splitting open to reveal a darkness deeper than the void itself. It was the end, and Elliot knew it. But even as the darkness reached for him, as the shadows sought to consume him whole, something stirred deep within him. A single fragile thought, a memory that refused to die. And in that moment, amidst the terror and the madness, Elliot found his voice. No, he whispered. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like they didn't belong to him. But they were his, all the same. They were the last spark of resistance. No, he said again, louder this time, his voice shaking with the weight of his defiance. The darkness faltered. The mask's grin wavered, just for a second, as if unsure. And then, the very air seemed to crack with energy, a low hum growing, vibrating with an intensity that split the very fabric of the void. Elliot reached out with a trembling hand, and in that final act, he fought. He fought against the pull of the void, against the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. With every ounce of strength he had left, he reached for the light.